All right, good evening, everyone, and good afternoon, wherever you are joining us from. Thanks for being here today. My name is Omolade Adunbi. I'm a professor of Afroamerican African Studies and director of the African Studies Center here at the University of Michigan. And thanks for everyone that is here today, and thanks for those who are joining us virtually. We appreciate the fact that you are able to make it this afternoon or this evening. So to begin with, I would like to thank everyone that makes this event possible, particularly the Dillon Human Rights Center, the African Studies Center, and the Department of Afro-American African Studies for their support. And I would also like to thank colleagues at the Dillon Human Rights Center, particularly Professor Steve Ratner, who is here with us, who is the director of the center. Then Rebecca Schenzel and Natasha Grosjean Alabigovich. I hope I'm not murdering anyone's names. Then colleagues at the ASC, the African Studies Center, particularly Marwa Hassan, Taya Pam, and colleagues in DAS, Justine Davis, Brian Klein, Elizabeth James, and Wayne I. So it's a long list of a lot of people who worked behind the scene to make sure that this event actually takes place today. So we're grateful to everyone. So today's event stems from our interest in deepening the conversation about democratic practices in Africa by paying attention to elections and its relationship to the promotion and protection of human rights. And in February 2023, Nigerians will go to the polls to elect new leaders. And as you all know, Nigeria is the most populous African nation with over 200 million people. So this election will also mark Nigeria's 24 years of a post-military authoritarian multi-party democracy. So it's a significant election. So since the transition to democracy, the country has been bedeviled with challenges of insecurity as a result of Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast of the country, oil insurgency in the Niger Delta region of the country, Biafra separatists in the east, and agitation for fiscal federalism in the southwest. Basically, there has been crisis in the country, challenges of insecurity, challenges of human rights protection and promotion. So at the same time, the elections in 2023 gives a new generation of voters, mainly youths, a hope of heralding a new era of political and economic reforms that could help strengthen democratic institutions in the country. Therefore, we are delighted to have this panel take on all of these important issues today. And our panelists are seasoned scholars, public intellectuals, and experts on elections, democracy, and human rights in Africa. The format for today's events are as follows. Each of our panelists will have 10 to 15 minutes to present their ideas about elections, democracy, and human rights. Professor Ann Pitcher will start with an overview of elections, human rights, and democracy in Africa. That will be followed by Ms. Idayat Hassan's ideas about what our organization does to protect and promote human rights in Nigeria, and also to guarantee free and fair elections in the country. And the panel will be rounded up with a presentation by Professor Ebenezer Obadare, who will speak on the challenges of democracy and human rights by going a little bit deeper into the history of Nigeria's Fourth Republic. Then at the end of the presentation, there will be Q&A. So we'll take questions from online, and one of my colleagues here, Rebecca, will monitor the online questions. And if there are questions online, she will read out the questions, or I will do for our panelists to answer. Then our audience will also have the opportunity to ask their questions. So before we begin, let me introduce our panelists. First is Professor Ann Pitcher. Professor Pitcher is the Joel Sermoff Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afro-American African Studies here at the University of Michigan. Our current research examines election-related violence, state capture, and distributive politics in developing countries, especially those in Africa. And she has conducted fieldwork, archival, and survey research in Angola, Mozambique, Kenya, Zambia, and South Africa. And her publications include 4 books and dozens of articles in scholarly journals. Along with Grant Masterson of the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, she is co-principal investigator of OBSERVE, that is the observation of subnational election-related violence and security in Africa, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Second is Ms. Idayat Hassan. Ms. Hassan, who unfortunately could not be here with us today, has graciously agreed to join us virtually, and you can all see her there. Ms. Hassan is the director of the Center for Democracy and Development, an Abuja-based policy think tank focusing on deepening democracy and development in West Africa. She's an attorney and a public intellectual who has held fellowships in universities across Europe and the United States. Our interests span democracy, peace, security, transitional justice, and information and communications technology for development in West Africa. As director of CDD West Africa, she has used her position to strengthen the use of technology-related research for the promotion of human rights and democratic practices in West Africa. And I must say that I always have found the election violence tracker developed by our organization useful in the last few election circles in West Africa. Ms. Hassan sits on the board of the Nigerian National Human Rights Commission, as well as the National Peace Committee, a body charged with maintaining peace during Nigeria's election. So our final panelist is Professor Ebenezer Obadare. Professor Obadare is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow for Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, Washington, D.C. Before joining CFR, he was Professor of Sociology at the University of Kansas, Lawrence. He is also Senior Fellow at the New York University Center for Global Affairs, as well as Fellow at the University of South Africa's Institute of Theology. Professor Obadare was Ralph Dahrendorf Scholar and Ford Foundation International Scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he obtained his PhD in social policy in 2005. So he holds a BA in history and MSc International Relations from the Obafemi Awolowo University, Ile-Ife, Nigeria. And Professor Obadare's primary areas of interest on which he has written extensively are civil society and the state, and religion and politics in Africa. In addition, he writes a blog for the Council on Foreign Relations on issues of security, elections, democracy, and human rights on a regular basis. And I'll encourage everyone to check out that blog. His most recent book, Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender, and Sexuality in Nigeria, is published by the University of Notre Dame Press. And Obadare is the editor of Journal of Modern African Studies, published by Cambridge University Press, and contributing editor of Current History, published by the University of California Press. As you can see, our list of panelists, they have a long list of accomplishments, and please join me in welcoming them. So,
thank you very much to the African Studies Center, especially the director, Omolade Adunbi, and the Dunia Human Rights Center for inviting me to join this panel, and welcome to all of you here and also online. I am going to give us a bit of background on the state of elections across the continent of Africa in order to contextualize the situation in Nigeria. So, beginning in the early 1990s, much of the political science literature on politics in Africa was celebrating what looked like monumental changes in Africa. In South Africa, apartheid had collapsed, and the ANC had secured a historic victory in the country's first democratic elections in 1994. In Ghana, the authoritarian government under Jerry Rawlings voluntarily adopted electoral competition in 1992. By the late 1990s, all of sub-Saharan Africa had legalized opposition parties with the exception of Eritrea, Eswatini, and Somalia. By 2022, sub-Saharan Africa has had hundreds of legislative and presidential elections. But according to a recent volume edited by Leo Ariola, Lisa Rackner, and Nick Vanderwall, democratic backsliding in Africa has been occurring. That volume is due out at the end of December. In case of any of you are interested in that, it's called Democratic Backsliding in Africa. According to them, liberal democracy in Africa has stagnated. As you can see from the slide, African countries are only marginally better than countries in the MENA region. So the Africa line is in blue. The Middle East and North African countries are in green. So their claim, and I think it's illustrated here in the slide, is that liberal democracy in Africa really has not progressed much further than it did in the early 1990s. Moreover, sub-Saharan African countries are less democratic than countries in Latin America and East and Central Europe that democratized around the same time that sub-Saharan African countries did. Additionally, African countries are no more democratic and in a number of cases considerably less democratic than they were in the 1990s. In some cases, the military has stepped in to sustain order or to install their own preferred leader, as in the cases of Burkina Faso and Chad. Where multi-party politics is still recognized, at least in a legal sense, incumbent governments have relied on electoral fraud and electoral violence to remain in power, stuffing ballot boxes or intimidating the opposition to stay away on election day. Some have manipulated the rules of their countries to extend or simply to overturn legally mandated term limits. For example, President Museveni of Uganda, who's now been in power since 1986, has had both constitutionally mandated term limits and an age limit on the president removed so that he can be president for life. As one of the chapters in the Ariola, Rackner, and Vanderwall volume documents, selective compliance with international norms has allowed some of these countries to forestall further reforms. For example, many African countries have established quotas with respect to the representation of women while refusing to acknowledge LGBTQIA2S plus rights. And some leaders, such as Obiang here of Equatorial Guinea, simply don't care what citizens or the international community thinks as long as he has control over vast riches. Recently, he won his sixth term in office with 95% of the vote and on extremely low turnout, I might add. Whereas the general picture regarding democracy on the continent looks pretty bleak, I think it's important to examine a few cases at the national and subnational levels to identify drivers of their particular political circumstances and also to assess the potential impact on the future of democracy in those cases. This also, I think, allows us to situate Nigeria, the Nigerian case, in relation to other countries on the continent. So I'll examine a few cases where I have personally observed their most recent elections and then make a few quick links to Nigeria. So the first case is Mozambique. And I would say that of the four places I've observed in the last few years, and that includes South Africa, Kenya, Angola, and Mozambique. I would say Mozambique in many ways is the worst case scenario. I mean, we hope that Nigeria does not follow in the footsteps of Mozambique. Democracy in Mozambique was implemented as the result of a peace accord following a long civil conflict between an opposition movement called Renamo and the independent government, the government that was established at independence for Limo, they following a long civil conflict in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s between these two, a peace accord was signed in 1992, and it mandated elections as the means for the political system to move forward. And that's been very common in a number of cases in Africa where elections are offered as sort of the war by another means between two belligerents in a conflict. In Mozambique's case, things became quite rocky after 2000s. The two belligerents continued to contest each other during elections, but they also returned to kind of low intensity warfare periodically after 2000. This has been this resurgent conflict between the main opposition party, Renamo, and the incumbent government, which has never lost an election since their first elections in 1994. This resurgent conflict has, in recent years, been followed by a growing Islamic insurgent movement in the north of the country. This movement, this insurgency in the north of the country is associated with the development of vast gas reserves in the north. It combines extreme disaffection, especially by young people. So I was interested to hear that Lade mentioned the role of young people in Nigeria, and I'd be interested to hear the ways in which they're participating and pushing for political changes in Nigeria. But in the Mozambican case, in addition to widespread disaffection by young people in the north of the country have also joined an insurgent movement that also has ties to Islamic extremists in the rest of Africa. This growing insurgent movement has heightened, I believe, the role of the military, which was already quite influential in Mozambican politics owing to the previous conflict. And the military is now very involved in both the development of gemstone mining and gas, the development of the natural gas sector. And they have an ally in the existing president who was formerly the Minister of Defense. So in comparison with Nigeria and this insurgent movement in northern Mozambique, it has a name. It's referred to as Al-Shabaab, similar to the insurgent movement in Kenya. And like Boko Haram in Nigeria, it is starting to dominate one of the main provinces, and in the Mozambique case, a province that's extremely wealthy. So the incumbent government, which has extensive linkages in most sectors of the economy, is committed to remaining in power. And in that sense, elections are the playing field for the opposition to compete in those elections is not a level one, and it's one where the incumbent government engages in electoral manipulation and strategic application of violence and selected fraud in order to stay in power. So looking now at South Africa, I've observed both the 2019 and the 2021 elections. South Africa, of course, is seen as one of the more liberal democracies on the continent. It has an amazing constitution, one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, where people are guaranteed, for example, the right to housing, where rights are widely recognized and at times widely honored. But after a storybook beginning in 1994 with the victory of the African National Congress under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress has become highly fragmented. It has been reelected 6 times in national elections, but it has become increasingly corrupt. It was a victim of state capture under the previous president, Jacob Zuma. And it's a highly fragmented party that during the 2021 municipal elections was affected by a high degree of intra-party violence. The last president, Jacob Zuma, was removed from office by a vote of no confidence. He was then investigated by a lengthy commission. He was found guilty of contempt of court and arrested and on the day that he was arrested, intra-party violence broke out and was followed by a wave of looting. So we looked at a colleague of mine, Rod Lentz at the University of Witwatersrand, and I looked at the effect of this 10-day period of extensive looting and violence. We found that it affected both turnout later in the 2021 municipal elections, and it affected vote share. And it did so in kind of different ways. In KwaZulu-Natal, which was the location of the bulk of the violence, we saw that within proximity to the incidents of looting, there was a decline in turnout. So here's a case where incidents of violence, as recorded by a well-known violence database, ACLED, violence tracker. I believe ACLED's also working with CDD in Nigeria. But here, where they tracked the violence, we were then able to correlate the incidence of violence with a decline in turnout to find an effect of violence on lower turnout in the case of KwaZulu-Natal, though not in another province, Gauteng. In Gauteng, people responded in a different way, and they responded by shifting their votes to another party. So voters in Gauteng province, where Johannesburg is located, shifted their votes away from the ANC to punish them for their misbehavior and for instigating the violence in the first place. So that's not a great scenario either, but it does show that voters in at least in this case held the ANC accountable by voting for another party. And then lastly, I want to talk about Kenya, which is the election that I observed recently in August of 2022. Kenya has a lot of great things going for it. The previous president, Uhuru Kenyatta, had served for 2 terms. He voluntarily stepped down in accordance with the constitutionally mandated term limits of 2 terms. So he did step down. It was a well-run election, in my view, a highly competitive election between 2 candidates. There were thousands, over 1,000 events recorded by ACLED of political disorder. There were armed attacks by the Islamic extremist movement that operates in the northeast of the country, Al-Shabaab. There were about 400 peaceful protests, which I always think you should back out of the political disorder number, just to see. I mean, people are exercising their right to protest, and that's, you know, that's acceptable. But I think what I want to emphasize, especially about the Kenyan elections, is the degree to which young people took an interest in the election. They talked a lot about the election. They responded to this appeal by Ruto that every hustle matters. And in the context of Kenya, that means every job, every informal sector job, from taxi driver to trader on the street, their job matters. And I think that that provoked a lot of conversation amongst Kenyans about what the political process should do and what politicians should do for them. So I thought that was an election that was conducted well, and where there really were conversations about poverty. That doesn't mean that there weren't irregularities or that there wasn't violence, because I show you here that there was, but that in general, this was an election that that mattered to people, and it was reflected in the conduct of the candidates and in the results of the election. All right, so with that as background, I will turn it over to the next presenter. Oh yes, so I wanted to just show that, and this fits in well with Idayat's presentation, because this is a comparison of violence in Nigeria and Kenya as recorded by her violence tracker.
Thank you, Anne. Next is Idayat Hassan.
Thank you very much. I've listened to Han and I felt like she should just keep talking and talking and talking. I'm enjoying it. Really, it's been interesting, particularly looking at the way she has been able to trace the history of elections in those select countries. And interestingly enough, it all coincides like with what is happening in Nigeria. It beats and it beats and it beats. From Mozambique to the last of Kenya is all applicable in our own instance as well. But it's also a very interesting elections, because for us as a country, it will represent the 7th consecutive election since the return to democracy in 1999 for Nigeria, and 24 years of unbroken run of democracy, the longest in the history of the country. I think out of the 4 republics that you can think of in Nigeria, that will be 24 years, the longest stretch as well. And it will also be the second time an incumbent president will not be on the ballot, particularly in the West African region, where there are lots of coup d'etat. And if there are no coup d'etat, there are either political or constitutional revision to ensure that presidents keep themselves in office. We call it tenure elongation. So President Buhari, as the incumbent, will not really be on the ballot. And it's also like we have the largest registered voters, like over 96 million registered voters. That's like all 14 countries, a third of the region, almost a third of the population of the region, and like all what you have preparing elections for the 14 other ECOWAS countries in the region that Nigeria will actually be managing in these elections itself. So it's an election of many firsts, and it's also conducted against the background of an improved electoral framework, because there is a new electoral act, and this electoral act has a lot of infusion of technology, which is what is getting the young people more and more interested in these elections, particularly with the Bermuda voter accreditation system, the BVAS, and the result viewing platform, which allows citizens to monitor the elections results in real time, get their, Excel, and start tabulating results in a very different and in a very fantastic way that we can think of. So it's an exciting time in spite of the challenges. There are lots of optimism that with more technology, the credibility of the elections can actually be improved. And currently, the Electoral Commission itself is also trying to go the way of Kenya at least, like an improved elections. And they are training even with the CDD, we are training like more than 300 journalists currently, with one just finishing in the Northeast in Gombe today, on understanding the Electoral Act and, of course, dealing with disinformation as it relates to the forthcoming elections, which are quite very, very high. But again, the credibility of this election itself will depend on how people can vote unencumbered during the elections itself, as insecurity continues to remain a critical issue. So we had the case study of Mozambique and the challenges in terms of insecurity, particularly looking at the role these non-state actors aligned to the Islamic states are playing in those in that country. It's the same you have in Nigeria, where you have the Boko Haram insurgents, of course, and at the same time we have the Islamic State in the West African province and the Ansaru linked to the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, taking a very important role in this election. So from the movement, so when you check out on ACLED, you will see that in the Northeast, where these groups were previously operative, there is a reduction in the conflict in that part of the country. But these actors have moved away, not just to the, just away from the Northeast. They are still in operation, but they've moved to the expansive Northwest, which is the vote bank of Nigeria, with more than 24 million registered voters out of this 96 million voters. And in some of those areas, they are even preventing campaigns from happening, like the Ansari in Kaduna, Birnin-Gwari. In this same stretch, when you are thinking of the Northwest, you have over 100 groups. We call them bandits, but they are warlordism, like likened to warlordism in this Northwest. And they have created enclaves. They are in control of these enclaves, and they hold sway there. They hold sway. In fact, in some instances, they seem like very civic-minded, but at the same time, they also seem political, because this might be an attempt to actually change the government, looking at the grievances they do have against the state. So they are also collecting the permanent voters card from citizens, and what they hope to do with that, we do not know. But as said, this violence is just one. And the 2015 has been the most significant insecurity we have faced as a country. But what we are currently experiencing ahead of the 2023 elections pale in comparison to 2015, where Nigeria had to actually postpone elections for 6 weeks to restore some law and order in the Northeast, an area almost the size of Belgium in 2015. Currently, you have multiple nodes of insecurity, common causes, like we call it at the CDD. In the Southeast, which is going to be a very predominantly difficult area, maybe much more difficult than even the Northwest, for Nigeria's elections, there are separationist agitation ongoing. And this separationist agitation, of course, is for the actualization of an independent state of Biafra, stemming from the civil war of the country between 1967 and 1970, and the way it was actually resolved. But what is interesting here is that the fractionalization of the groups of this IPOB, which seems to be the lead group, into like 3 different sects, are further heightening the insecurity, with some of them taking more difficult stance than even the modern body. And their ability to instrumentalize disinformation also means that they are able to hold sway, not just rig the mind of the people, but possibly and actually suppress votes ahead of the elections. And with what they did in the Anambra governorship elections, which held in 2021, it had one of the lowest turnout, with like 10% turnouts in these elections, so the same might also prevail, particularly as the state continue to hold the leader of this group, even though there has been a court judgment, up to the level of the Court of Appeal, asking for his release. When you look at the level of violence, I didn't come with our accolade. She has shown us a bit of it. What is also interesting is that compared to January to October 2021 and January to October 2022, there has been an increase in the violent conflict that the country has actually been experiencing like that. So there is a serious increase this way. But these notes of insecurity are wide. You still have the herders and farmers conflict, which crisscrosses at least 20 of the states in the country. Like 20 of the states, you have criminality. What at the end of the day you are looking at is the accessibility to polls, the security of polling materials, the security of polling officials, and the ability to declare a win in some of the in the presidential elections and possibly some federal elections itself, especially if some areas become extremely hard to reach. But prevailing insecurity is just a small character of the forthcoming Nigeria elections, of the forthcoming Nigerian elections itself. Political violence also holds sway, and it has been part and parcel of previous Nigeria's elections. But without much ado on the political violence, I've decided to look at not just the IDP issue, but to look at what are the real criteria when you look at human rights and how this actually restricts the space for the people. So taking like two examples of prerequisites of human rights as it relates to elections, I looked at the issue of freedom of assembly. Ongoing in many parts of the country, governors are enacting laws, and these laws are making it very difficult for parties to fairly compete in the elections. And this even includes the ability to campaign. So if you look at Rivers and in Zamfara states, the governors banned political rallies, in one based on insecurity, while in the other made a law that you have to pay between 10,000 from starting from 11,000 US dollars and give 2 weeks notice to actually have access to a primary school where you can actually conduct election, you can conduct campaign, irrespective of the position you are actually vying for. As it relates to freedom of expression at the same time, or freedom to receive and impart information, some states even ban like 3 radio stations for covering unsanctioned rally, while others have enacted laws that you cannot place billboard until the content is not just about paying from between the $11,000 upward, but they also have to sanction the content of this campaign as well as, of course, the large role that data and disinformation is playing in elections. The data law, when it comes to privacy, are very lax and almost non-existent, while at the same time, you have disinformation as a strategy to rig the mind of the people, making it difficult to even know the choice they are making. Maybe it makes it a choiceless one in the real sense of the word. So these are the prevailing issues, but the prognosis at the end of the day would look like how the Electoral Commission is able to deploy itself. The ability to call a win might be a challenge. The ability to get the reach, which the Constitution also provides for in terms of the 25% spread in 24 states plus the Federal Capital Territory, if insecurity continue to prevail. But importantly, the fundamental rights to actually vote and participate in elections, like these are like inalienable rights for many people. And the only opportunity in many African countries people also do have to be part and parcel of democracy may be taken out as more and more people become disenfranchised and their inability for them to participate as internally displaced persons in these elections. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Idayat Hassan. Next is Ebenezer Obadare.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So it's really nice to be here. Professor Adunbi has asked me to say a few words about the February 2023 general election in Nigeria in relation to the struggle for human rights and democracy in the country and perhaps beyond. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. The subject, as we all know, is a vast and complex one. And as I pondered the best entree into it, I was reminded of a question that a member of the audience asked me last week during a panel on the state of human rights in the world at the American Academy of Religion conference in Denver, Colorado. The questioner wanted to know whether, considering the clouds that have gathered around Western ideas and epistemologies of recent, the idea of human rights still has any meaning or holds any appeal in an African context, or whether it is best abandoned as a non-serviceable Western construct. As part of my answer, I vehemently rejected the notion that a principle so essential and universal as human rights could be reduced to the property of a particular region or culture. My vehemence was informed first by my disappointment at the superficial conflation of human rights with Western countries, and consequently the supposed rejection of the idea on account of the well-established moral hypocrisy of the latter. I felt at the time, and I continue to believe, that the hypocrisy of the West in upholding human rights, examples of which are too numerous to detain us here, can and must be separated from the very essence of the principle of human rights. That is, the right of every human being to be treated in a particular way and to be accorded certain privileges purely on the basis of their humanity. This principle, it seems to me, has to be universal as a matter of definition, and is therefore worth upholding and defending, regardless of the political abuses and moral contortions of its most fervent defenders. If the idea of human rights means anything at all, the emphasis being on the human, it has to transcend race, region, religion, gender, sexuality, and any other identity marker. Either that or it degenerates into relativistic nonsense. In any case, and this is the second reason for my vehemence at the conference, working at the intersection of journalism and advocacy in the military era in the 1990s, my generation, and Professor Adunbi is my witness here, my generation did not have the luxury of wondering whether human rights was a Western construct. The harsh reality of life under military dictatorship did not allow for those neat distinctions. Rather, we were too busy fighting for those principles to pay any heed to the idea. We were too busy fighting and advocating for a free press, for freedom of expression, for the rather to gather peaceably, against detention without trial, and so on and so forth. We were too busy fighting for those principles to pay any heed to the idea that what we were literally putting our young lives on the line for was a foreign concept. It seemed to us that we could not live the kind of life we all considered worthy, productive, and conducive to human flourishing without having those freedoms. And the language of human rights was the perfect vehicle to capture our aspiration. More to the point, questions of intellectual provenance being the last thing on our minds, we saw those freedoms as philosophically inextricable from the struggle to inaugurate liberal democratic norms, something that successive military regimes in Nigeria had launched a determined assault on in their barbarous bid to abolish civil society and make the public space safe for autocracy. In sum, it has always been the understanding of pro-democracy and civil society advocates, whether in Nigeria or Africa more broadly, that the struggle for human rights is part and parcel of the struggle for liberal democracy. And accordingly, progress or regress in the sphere of human rights is regarded as proxy for the same in the struggle for democratic consolidation. If we accept the hypothesis that progress in human rights parallels advance in the establishment and consolidation of democratic norms, the picture that emerges from Nigeria over the course of the Fourth Republic is mixed. First, the good news. From the vantage of the present, more than 2 decades into civil rule, there's no doubt that Nigeria is all told a freer country. For the outgoing year, Freedom in the World, that's Freedom House's annual study of political rights and civil liberties worldwide, rates the country as partly free, acknowledging that significant progress has been made since the prolonged winter of military rule in the 1980s and 1990s. The Nigerian press, instructively an older institution than the Nigerian state, is as robust, vulgar, and ebullient as ever. The Nigerian social media is energetic, unruly, and splendidly ungovernable, while a digitally savvy younger demographic continues to outwit a state that is more or less analog, as we saw, for example, in its creative outmaneuvering of the state during last year's Twitter ban. All in all, the public sphere of today is a far cry from its vitiated and enervated pre-1999 predecessor. Suffice to say, it's not been all sweetness and light. And insofar as the public space is less constrained, it is not for want of trying by the state. As the same Freedom House report I just mentioned notes, quote, security challenges, including the ongoing insurgency by the Boko Haram militant group, kidnappings, and communal and sectarian violence in the Middle Belt region, continue to threaten the human rights of millions of Nigerians. The military and law enforcement agencies often engage in extrajudicial killings, torture, and other abuses. Civil liberties are undermined by religious and ethnic bias, while women and LGBT people face pervasive discrimination. The vibrant media landscape is impeded by criminal defamation laws, as well as the frequent harassment and arrest of journalists who cover politically sensitive topics, unquote. Between 2000 and 2007 alone, according to a Human Rights Watch report, police shot and killed more than 10,000 people, which averages to more than 1,400 victims annually. The massacre of ordinary Nigerian citizens in the Jotan of Odi, in the oil-producing Bayelsa state in November 1999, by soldiers apparently acting on orders from then-President Obasanjo, remains fresh in the minds of many human rights advocates in the country. Nigerians, particularly young people's frustration at these killings and human rights abuses, and the persistence of impunity by law enforcement generally, was the main reason behind the 2020 EndSARS protests, which lasted several weeks and attracted global media coverage. In a tragic irony, a general protest against police brutality is today remembered for the killing of an unspecified number of protesters by members of the Nigerian army. So why the question as to why human rights abuses persist in Nigeria is therefore complicated. It should be remembered that human rights violations in the country are not just a simple matter of an unaccountable state against vulnerable citizens. While violence by law enforcement is rampant and often brutal, it is by no means exceptional. The banality of everyday incivility in Nigeria is such that Nigerians tend to treat one another shabbily and expect discourtesy as a matter of course in their quotidian interactions, whether formal or informal. Although there is no justification for violence by police against those they are meant to protect, we must acknowledge that the police more or less treat citizens they encounter in the course of their duties in practically the same way that most Nigerians in positions of power treat their subordinates. The only difference, a crucial one, is that the police tend to be armed and their use of violence is, at least in principle, legitimate. Given the overall masculinization of the social space in Nigeria, the all-important gender component of this daily dosage of bodily violations cannot be overemphasized. Because of this situation, the language of human rights remains a potent instrument of social mobilization in Nigeria. And if anything has changed in recent times, it is the gradual expansion of the language to incorporate economic rights. We see this most vividly in the strident vocabulary of the obedient, a movement that, insofar as it taps into and aggregates long-standing popular frustration at the system among students, workers, and urban malcontents of various tribes, arguably precedes the political ascendancy of Peter Obi, the Labour Party presidential standard bearer. Now, whatever becomes of Obi's candidacy, the obedient can take pride in having infused a certain moral urgency into the 2023 presidential campaign and giving at least a cross-section of Nigerians the confidence that a seemingly entrenched two-party monopoly of the political system can be disrupted. The rise of the obedient in Nigeria is broadly consistent with a regional pattern, I think Anne mentioned some of this earlier, a regional pattern of strong support for specific democratic values among young Africans. For example, 85% support freedom of belief, 70% plan to vote in upcoming elections, and large majorities support doing more to address inequality and access to internet and infrastructure. Part of the reason why this strong appetite for democratic values in Africa is significant is that it contradicts growing anti-democratic sentiment in Europe and the United States. For example, while few Americans are confident in American democracy, younger Americans are especially skeptical. Nor is democratic skepticism limited to the United States. Extrapolating from data collected across 154 countries, a report by the Center for the Future of Democracy at Cambridge University estimates that the number of individuals who are dissatisfied with the condition of democracy in their country rose by 10 percentage points from 48% to 58% between 1995 and 2020. More disturbingly, research early this year by a UK-based think tank, Onward, found that 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds agree that having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections is a good way to run the country, more than double the number in 2017. In a nutshell, the 2023 election in Nigeria is coming at a time when global democracy is undergoing a stress test, even as doubts are being renewed about the universality of human rights. Across West Africa, where Nigeria is a regional leader, many will hope not just for a free and fair election, but some reassurance that events in the country will prove that recent military interventions in Mali, Chad, Guinea, Sudan, and Burkina Faso are a mere aberration. Outside the continent, observers, including the country's growing diaspora, will be eager for Nigeria to consolidate on the slender gains of the past 2 decades and take the next step towards achieving genuine economic prosperity. For a country famously tormented by chronic insecurity, political instability, and economic uncertainty, it's actually not a bad place to be. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you very much. So at this stage, we'll open it up for questions. And the way we'd like to proceed is to read out questions that are posted online. Then those in the audience can also ask questions. So we'll take a collection of questions, then let our panelists respond to those questions. Then if there is still more time, then we get back to the audience, both online and in person, to ask their questions. So we keep going until we run out of time. But I would like to begin by asking my set of questions that I have here. And this can be addressed by all the panelists. The first question that I have is that I'm thinking about the population in Africa, and there are a lot of data that shows that the continent have some of the youngest population in the world. And Nigeria, being a country that is about over 200 million people, accounts for a substantial part of this population. But at the same time, when you look at representation, so this young population doesn't show anything show up in terms of who is representing those who are at the helms of affairs, or those who are at the helms of affairs in the continent, and specifically Nigeria. So my question is, how is it that a lot of the African countries, particularly Nigeria, are represented by those who are over 60 years, whereas the population data shows something that is contrary to that, that is younger population, but being represented by the older generation. So what is responsible for that? Why and how is it that the younger population are not able to take on the mantle of leadership at this time, despite all of the organizing that they do, both online and offline? Then the second question that I have is about the state of democracy and human rights itself. So this is a global crisis. A lot of scholars have speculated about how the world is facing maybe democratic retreat. So what exactly does that mean? And can we speculate that countries like Nigeria might not face such a democratic retreat considering the fact that they've been successfully organizing elections since transition from authoritarian rule to democracy in 1999. And if they are not able to, or if they are going to escape this democratic retreat that is being speculated globally, what are the indicators or what are the indices of that? Then the third question is about the use of technology. So as Idayat Hassan mentioned in our presentation, the 2023 election in Nigeria is going to be highly it's going to use a lot of technology, and the voters card and the ways in which election results are going to be reported is one indicator of that. Then the second part is that a lot of those who are engaged in the electoral process right now uses a lot of social media platforms. So can those active use of social media platforms translate to electoral value for many of the youths who are engaged? So those are my three questions, and I'll open it up to the audience online and here to ask their questions as well. Over to you guys. Yeah, and please, could you introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tristan Keen. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Ross Business School, and my research interest is studying firms in emerging markets, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean. So my question is, do you think the role of the inflow of Chinese capital in the continent in terms of going towards building infrastructure and various developmental projects, do you think that influence from China has any type of impact or will have any type of impact on democratic processes?
Thank you. Yeah, we'll take one more. And
thank you. My name is Sumena. I'm a graduate student in anthropology. I was wondering what's the role of religious institutions such as, the mega churches we know of. I'm from East Africa, and now we have this prosperity gospel, prosperity party, which came via Nigeria, not directly from the US. So I'm very curious to hear about, we talked about, Islamic fundamentalism and all those things, and if you have something to share.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, we'll take one more question, then allow our panelists to respond. Then we'll come back to everyone.
Thank you. I am Professor Sylvia Pedraza from Sociology and American Culture. And I think my question follows from your demographic sort of questions, that so much of the population is very young. And that means that they were not there, or they were growing up under a dictatorship. And so I'm wondering how their political attitudes and so on are maybe different than those of the older people. I think it's a variant of your question.
Sure. Thank you. All right, we'll start with Ms. Hassan.
Thank you very much. I think to the first question, it's a matter of inclusion. We have looked at the data set, even across Africa, to see if there are indeed legal barriers preventing people from vying for office. You find that most of them from the position, the age to actually vie for office starts from like 30, 35 years, even 18 in some countries. Presidency average is 40 years across the 55 countries in Africa when you take it as an. So it's not more of the legal barrier that is preventing people from vying in elections, but more of the close political environment playing a very active role itself. Beyond the close political environment, of course, which of course takes us to the issue of the nature of politics, where politics is very dirty, the violence that it goes, how the political party system itself is very structured, the lack of internal party democracy, which does not give the opportunity for young people to emerge as candidates in the first instance, also adds to why they do not get to rule themselves, and the cost of politics. So you are talking about the bulk of young people in Africa being unemployed, but they are unemployed and they do not have the war chest to vie in elections. The cost of reform, for instance, in Nigeria's elections was like 100 million naira. Then that was more than $200,000 in just one political party. The average party sold a nomination form at like $100,000. How many of the young people would actually be able to afford such cost? So put together, all this actually contributes in ensuring that young people do not emerge. And young people also prefer to be in civil society, thinking that politics is very dirty. So it's the issue of voice and participation where they find other enclave within which to operate in an electoral system. And it has not helped. And that is why some of these countries also are facing some of the challenges they are facing. But when it comes to the state of democracy, I want to also believe that democracy itself is very resilient. Across West Africa, there has been like 6 coup d'etat, ratification coup, ratified by coup, different coup, and even unsuccessful coup d'etat. But in all these coup d'etat, why it was supported by the people was the failure of democracy to deliver development to the people, and development in terms of putting food on their table, and all of a sudden the issue of security in countries like Mali, Burkina playing a very, very important role in determining it. Then we've also seen the role faulty elections play in the democratic rollback that is being experienced. So you take Mali, aside from the insurgency, the faulty parliamentary elections contributed, as well as the Guinea-Conakry coup d'etat. So these 2 factors have put itself out there on the front burner as part of the challenges. But the young demography are organizing. In all these countries, who actually stood up to fight for or in support of the coup, it was the young people and the civil society. And Ebenezer said it earlier, in every form, in every facet of democracy, either pre-independence, the struggle for democracy itself in the 90s, up till now, the people continue to reimagine themselves, either as civil society, broadly and expansively defined, to push for accountability. And the social media, when you talk about social media, it is a positive. But the nature of politics, for instance, in Nigeria, will not mean that your popularity online will translate to votes, really, because 17 points, like across West Africa, just 17.8% are online. But there is a link between the online and the offline. But this does not play when vote buying might determine actually who holds sway and who wins in the election. In the Kenyan election, we also saw the role of vote buying beyond other ways of voter mobilization. And technology is not a silver bullet. We continue to be the only part of the world where we see that technology remains a force of good, but it's also particularly social media, because we use it to galvanize, we use it to train, we use it to hold elected officials accountable. But the disinformation and the lax law or attempt to use it to also restrict the civic space remains a challenge. And I think my last point will be on the liberal influences. The liberal influences is not just China. If you take the example of West Africa, you just have China, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have Turkey, you have UAE, you have all these becoming very, very large actors who are helping democracy to roll back because of their strategy, which is not tied to any form of not just accountability, human rights principle, is respective of the ruler. And when you take Russia as an example, Russia, of course, has no specific strategy. It's country by country. It doesn't service country, it services the elite. So this has helped in terms of rolling back democracy. And in the future, it might actually be the future where the Western world will no longer be able to define that these are the benchmarks. This is what constitutes free and fair and credible elections in their own parlance. As long as people can get roads built by China, they can get security provided directly by Russia or the Wagner Group, they can get support to subvert the internet by any of these actors. So there are real challenges.
All right, thank you. Anne?
Okay. Can you hear me? All right. So on this question of, why are there so many old people in politics? I might not be the person to answer that, but I think they have money, they have name recognition, they have power. And I think there's something that a lot of people who maybe don't study Africa don't realize, but there are a number of African countries that have very stable parties, that have been around since the period even before independence. And they have they're not all hierarchical, but they have a very disciplined and procedural way of getting into the party and moving up in the party. And if you look at the Front for the Liberation in Mozambique, the ruling party of Mozambique, or the MPLA in Angola, the process of becoming a loyal party member takes a long time. So even though within Frelimo, they do have democratic means of moving up the party rank, it still takes a long time. And by the end of it, by the time you've gotten to a position where you can compete in national elections, you are very well known, and a lot of people owe you favors. So I think that it's important to remember that that party politics can work that way in Africa. And then the other thing is that I think that, of course, there are a number of young people who are anti-democratic, but I think more in this country and also across Africa, people are anti-party. Young people are anti-party. They're not against participation. They're not against reducing human rights abuses or protesting against police violence or political participation, but they're against kind of mainstream old style ways of participating in politics. So they really, in some cases, don't want to have anything to do with the same old party systems that have been around, in some cases since the 1960s, in other cases since the early 1990s. But they're very active. They can be cynical, I think, partly because they feel that if African countries have become democratic since the 1990s, why don't we see more change? And the graph I showed you indicates that democracy hasn't really improved. It's kind of stagnated at the level that it reached in 1990, which wasn't very great anyway. And they're not seeing material changes to their lives, and they're not seeing avenues for greater participation as a result of the democratic process. Having said that, I agree with Idayat that there's incredible technological changes that to me seem like they ultimately will be quite beneficial. I mean, I think the new means of checking voters in, of tracking votes, tracking the registration process, tracking who's voted and who hasn't, following the process all the way up the line until it reaches the national level was something that I was impressed with at Kenya. In Kenya, you can basically go from the constituency level in the Kenyan elections to the national results, and you can kind of keep track of what every polling station did voted and how many people voted and that sort of thing. And I think that I was speaking with Victor Ratang, who's Kenyan and who's a grad student here in poli-sci, speaking with him today about how it really is kind of incredible that that you can track nearly every vote in Kenya during the 2022 elections. I was also impressed with the role of election commissions, and Idayat mentioned that in Nigeria. I think they're getting better and better. The election commission in South Africa is, I think, one of the most well-trained, one of the most technologically savvy commissions on the continent. So I do see a lot of progress there, but I also see these countervailing forces. China doesn't care whether African countries commit human rights abuses or not. And the dominant parties in Africa, the parties that have managed to get elected time and time again, are modeling their own party systems and their own political agendas after China. They send people to China to learn how the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, reproduces itself in power over and over again. So they're not absorbing the information about China from the newspaper. They actively go to China to learn how the system works there. And I think that is something that we need to know more about and that we should examine in more detail.
All right, thank you. Ebenezer.
Anything left to say? Let me quickly, just a couple of sentences about, I'm going to try and respond to the question about China and about religious institutions. But I think with respect to youth, I think it's important not to just valorize young people simply because they are young people. I think it's, yeah. And I say that not because I'm not young people, but I think it's important to understand how complicated the agency of young people is. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, that the fact that they are young and that they are swearing rhetoric doesn't mean that they exist outside the political structure. Sometimes their agency is such that they end up propping up the very structures that they are purporting to disestablish. I mean, you could pretty much ask the same question about women, right? Majority of people in Nigeria, for instance, the population at least show the census shows are women, which raises the question, why is the system patriarchal, despite the fact that majority are women? And the answer, uncomfortable at times, is that sometimes you need the agency of women to prop up the system, that keeps women down. I think Anne was, right on the money about China. But one thing I would like to also emphasize about China is we shouldn't infantilize leaders in Africa. So it's one thing to say China is profoundly anti-democratic. It is, right? It's going over and above the heads of African people, civil society in Africa, and talking directly to African leaders. China is offering a model of governance that is the very antithesis of what the United States, at least in theory, offers. China is saying, I don't care if you hold elections. I don't care if elections are credible. I want to do a deal with you to that extent. So it's the dream of every leader who wants to stay, for the next, 2,000 years. But the onus has to be on those leaders. It's not China's fault. We should look at the weaknesses in political institutions, the personalization of power and so on, that China is exploiting. China is not to be blamed. African leaders are to be blamed. The last question about religion, can I plug my book? I think the book on religion and politics in Nigeria, I would encourage anyone who has a spare, $10, buy my book, Pentecostal Republic, Religion and the Struggle for State Power in Nigeria. It basically argues that you can't understand politics in Nigeria in the Fourth Republic without understanding the power of Pentecostalism as a social movement. The other book, the one that just came out, argues that you can't understand Pentecostalism without understanding the agency of Pentecostal pastors. So if you're going to buy one, you might as well buy the second one.
All right, thank you. We've got a couple of questions online. I'll read a few of those, then allow others to also ask their questions. The first is to Ms. Hassan. I appreciate the way you outlined the challenges to credible and peaceful election in Nigeria. However, what did you think about the role of the social media in heightening tension and creating possibility of violence in the forthcoming general elections? Then that's for Ms. Hassan. Then there is another question about refugees and human rights in Nigeria, that with over 3 million internally displaced persons within the country, and 85,000 refugees and asylum seekers finding a new home within Nigeria. What place do they have in the new democratic dispensation in the country? Then there is a question for Professor Obadare. The question is that you seem to accord too much influence to the obedience, tapping into popular discontent. In the same way that users are using social media, the political class is not backing down, basically suggesting that the political class is also engaging with social media. Now, what do you have to say about that? Then the final one, can you speculate on what this crisis that you talked about mean, particularly in relation to the tendencies among African governments to pick and choose what aspects of democracy to practice? And what role do these have in thinking about the future of human rights? So note those questions down. Then audience, if you have more questions to ask, happy to take your questions. Anyone?
They're tired of us.
Yeah, Steve.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation so far. I'm Steve Ratner. I teach international law at the law school. I'm the director of the Donia Center. I was just wondering if any of you would like to consider the relevance of the resource curse for democracy in Nigeria. It obviously has a different effect in every country, depending on what kind of political system one has, who is doing the exploitation of the resources and their relations with the government. But in the case of Nigeria, I'd be curious to know whether it's had a positive or a negative effect on democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question. All right, 1 minute to respond to the questions. I'll start with Professor Obadare.
Okay, I'll do the question about the obedience. The point I was making is that the obedience as a movement precedes Peter Obi. If you think about the sentiment that I think the obedience are tapping into, you could basically see, look at some of the placards and think this is a protest taking place among students in 1985. It's the same thing. They want regular electricity. They want, internet. They want security. They want jobs. Basically reflecting what young people across the continent also want. I've cited in my blog before a recent survey by the Ichikowi Foundation in South Africa. A survey of young people in Africa between the ages of 18 and 24. 90% of them will leave the continent at the earliest opportunity if they could, right? What do they want? 4 things: infrastructure, education, jobs, the last one, internet, right? If you think about what the obedient are talking about, and I'm saying this without any prejudice to the political strength or weaknesses of Peter Obi, but I'm saying that in a sense, the obedient itself, in terms of tapping into mass disaffection, workers' rights and all those things, the sentiment itself predates the emergence of Peter Obi as a presidential candidate. That's the point I was trying to make.
All right, thank you. Anne?
Well, I didn't see that these questions were really directed at me. I think this question about the relevance of the resource curse is a critical one. In my view, the resource curse has been extremely damaging to democracy. It provides an incentive for political leaders to hold on to power, and it seems that in almost every case, they have found ways to do that. So I can't see that it's enabled enabled the advance of democracy. But, it also sort of depends on which resources you're talking about. I think in the case of oil, not at all. I think that if you expand your idea of resources and you start to include copper and coal, then the picture changes. Of course, Zambia is a good example of a country that's most of its wealth rests on copper, and it's also managed to sustain democracy, not at a great level, but it's managed to sustain it over the last 30 years. So I think the record for oil producing countries has not been good. I think if you broaden the understanding of resources, then I think it's no better or no worse than countries that don't have resources.
All right, thank you. Hassan?
Oh, thank you very much. I think the first question on the social media, these elections is showing us something different. The same way we have political talks, that's how we now have online talks because social media will be an enabler of violence in the forthcoming elections. And it's as a result of the proliferation of actors. So as you have the individuals whom we call the soldiers of mouth, the data boys, or the influencers, at the same way we have the international companies, and we even have foreign influence and governments also intervening in the political space. And this is used either to glorify a candidate or delegitimize the institutions working in these elections. And what we found quite interesting with our work at the CDD is that deepfake might actually define the elections. There are already projections for post-election violence. When we asked people in a survey yet to be published, 48% said that they feel there will be violence, while the other 36% fear for violence in the forthcoming elections. And when you ask at the same time, what are the influences they listen to? The social media and the religious leaders came out on top. Like that. It used to be the religious leader who controlled the narrative, but now the social media is playing an active part. So we need to really fear for the social media and walk around having a form of compact that can actually monitor and bring people to accountable, particularly as we expect to see more deep fake emerge in the elections, in the elections itself, not even prelude to the elections. On the second question, which has to do with the refugee and the IDP, unfortunately, they do not have a stake in the country. In the Northeast is where we used to have a huge refugee population. Out of the 27 local governments in Borno State, refugee and IDPs, out of the 27 local governments in Borno State, 26 have already been returned back to their communities, their ancestral home, with the exception of Guzamala people still there in Maiduguri. And in other parts of the country where we have internally displaced persons, there is the politics of ensuring that there is no formal declaration of a IDP camp. And that's why I was saying they find it very difficult. They wouldn't be able to participate in these elections. So they are more or less currently living as people who are existing in court, but they are not existing really on paper, nor do even humanitarians have access to them. So I think this is a real challenge. And this is a real challenge, and it's one that has to do both with the humanitarian and, of course, electoral implication. I think the resource cost, they should ask Professor Adunbi that question. Is better suited.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists, Professor Obadare, Professor Mpicha, Ms. Idayat, Hassan. We hope you'll be able to join us one day in Michigan here. And thanks, everyone that joined us online. Thanks to our audience for your patience with us. And finally, thank you to the Donia Human Rights Center and the African Studies Center, as well as the Department of Afro-American African Studies for bringing this event to us today. And everyone have a good evening. Please join us for a small reception right here. And Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.